All these accidents that happen follow the dot. Coincidence makes sense only with you. You don't have to speak. I feel emotional landscapes. They pass on me. The little gets out, and you push me up to this state of emergency. How beautiful to be state of emergency is where I want to be. All that no one sees, you see what's inside of me. Every nerve that hurts, you heal deep inside of me. Ooh, you don't have to speak. I feel emotional landscapes. They pass on me. I confuse. A little gets out, and you push me up to this state of emergency. How beautiful to be state of emergency is where I want to be. State of emergency, how beautiful to be.
Nhà tôi bên chiếc cầu soi nước, em đến thăm một lần. Bao lũ chim rừng họp đàn trên khắp bến xuân. Từng đôi chim trong nắng diêu dích ca thu. Cành đào hẹn nắng tràn hoa. Chim ca thương nhớ, chim ngân phá cuốn con ngây ngất trong hương. Dìu nhau theo dốc núi nơi ven đồi, chỉ thấy chim ghét lèo im. Tới đây chân bước lòng ngập ngừng, núi non như dáng thuyền sóng nước. Tao em rung theo gió nhẹ đen thùng ngoài bên xuân. Sương mênh mông che lấp kín ngọn xoài.
Welcome everyone to Accented IRL. If y'all could show some love in the chat to our in-house DJ Puzzle for spinning the old school Viet oldies for us today on such an important day in our history, April 30th, 2021. Thank you so much, DJ Puzzle, and we'll be bringing back up DJ Puzzle when it's when it's time for the intermission. Welcome, everyone. My name is Philip Nguyen. I am the producer for Accented Dialogues in Diaspora. And for those of y'all that are new, welcome to Accented IRL, the edition of Accented Dialogues in Diaspora that we're doing with the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. Just as some context for those of y'all that are new, for those of y'all who this isn't your first show, welcome back. Accented really started as a response to the pandemic. We wanted to find and provide some sort of intimate space for Southeast Asian and Vietnamese cultural producers to gather and have conversation on their work, their stories, their passions, their inspirations, and what they've been up to since shelter in place in the pandemic. So Accented Dialogues in Diaspora is a project of the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network, which believes that the stories, imaginaries, and poetics of a thriving Vietnamese diaspora can unite our global community. Today, we have a really incredible show with you, a beautiful lineup. And to tell you a little bit more about who we're going to be featuring on our show today, April 30th, 2021, as we reflect on 46 years of the fall of Saigon, on April 30th, 1975, is our host, Viet Thanh Nguyen, who is the author of The Sympathizer, Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War, The Refugees, and Race and Resistance, Literature, Politics in Asian America. One of his most recent books was Chicken of the Sea, done with his son Ellison, and his latest book is the highly anticipated sequel to The Sympathizer. If y'all could please show some love for our host, Viet Thanh Nguyen.
Bang bang, anh bắn ngay em bang bang, em ngã trên sân bang bang, tiếng súng khi xưa bang bang, ta sẽ không quên bao giờ.
Thanks so much, DJ Puzzle. Thanks, Philip. That was Thanh Lan's version of Bang Bang. It's both in French and Vietnamese. You can find it on YouTube. It's really a romantic version of that song that, to me, just encapsulates all of the feelings that I have about being Vietnamese, and especially being Vietnamese during that time of war. And that's partly what we're talking about today. It's really just such an honor to bring to you some of the guests that we have tonight around this day of April 30th. And of course, today is the 46th anniversary of April 30th. April 30th marked the end of the very long war in Vietnam, which dated from, depending on your point of view, 1963 with the arrival of Americans, or 1954 with the departure of the French, or 1945 with the public proclamation by Ho Chi Minh of independence from France. So a very, really tumultuous period, obviously, in Vietnamese history that has shaped so many of us and obviously led to the creation of a Vietnamese diaspora. And many of us have very deep feelings about April 30th and what it means. And we wanted to bring to you some writers and artists who have thought very much about this complicated history, and in several of the cases have lived or had lived through that history as eyewitnesses and as participants. So our first guest tonight is Lan Cao. She is a professor of law at Chapman University and also an author. She's the author of the novels Monkey Bridge and The Lotus and the Storm, and a book of nonfiction with her daughter, Harlan Margaret Van Cao, Family in Six Tones, A Refugee Mother and American Daughter. Welcome, Lan. Chị Lan.
Hỏi gió phiêu du qua bao đỉnh trời, hỏi những đêm sâu đèn vàng héo.
Can you tell us what that song was and why you picked it?
Yes, yeah. Thing to tell you and share with you the song. So it's called Lấy Đá, and I know the version that's sung by Cô Khánh Ly. And the reason why that song is so meaningful to me, it's extremely soulful. And you may recall, I don't know if you remember, but there's a lot in Vietnamese songs and lyrics and myths about stones and how stones have feelings. There are a lot of songs about stones, how they match our feelings and we're part of nature, and how they yearn and long just like the human soul. And the Lấy Đá especially has meaning for me because it's about the tears of a stone. And there's a line which it's not in the part that was played, but it says, it goes, thuở ấy tôi như con chim lạc đàn, which means at that time, I was like a bird that has lost its flock. And it reminds me a lot of April 30. Yeah. Because I felt very much like, because April 30 is not like a political or a historical event to me, even though, of course, it is a momentously historical event for Vietnam and for the US and for sort of the international system. But I relate to it as like a stone that yearns and has feelings. And the stone also, there's a story in Vietnam, in Vietnamese myths, about this woman who so misses her husband who's departed that waiting for him, she became a stone, right? So in many ways, I felt like coming here and having to start a new life. One part of me in terms of coping was to be like a stone. And to just sort of emotionlessly go forward with the eye on the prize. But because stones also have longing and yearnings and feelings and tears, that's the other part that's expressed in this song. And the of losing your flock and basically searching for a new flock is also a very, very deep part of me. And a lot of times I think of everything that is of significance in terms of, is it before April 30th or after April 30th? Because I am 1.5 generation. And astonishingly, even though I've been here for 40 something years and only about 13 years in Vietnam, and maybe probably only 9 of which have active memory, I feel still very much rooted in Vietnam, and everything that I have done since arriving in this country, whether it be in my scholarship or in my fiction, has been trying to make sense of Vietnam, the war, and its relationship not just to the regional area of Indochina, but also just sort of the idea of emerging economies. How do you economically and politically develop the issues of human rights, international human rights, and democracy? Can the two be separated, or are they basically intertwined? And especially women's rights as well.
We can get to all of those things when we have all of our panelists here, but I really did want to say I loved your explanation of the song, and I'd always wanted to write a story about the woman who turned to stone on the cliff waiting for her husband to come back. Never could make it work out. So really, thank you for picking that song. We had one comment from the audience, and I haven't seen this comment before, but the commenter asks that we make sure we get the pronunciation of the names of our guests right, which I think I have done in the past. But Lan Cao, am I saying it right?
Yes, but my full name is Cao Thị Phương Lan, and I'm very, I guess, a little bit remorseful about dropping the Phương. Because when I was in high school, I was so teased by the name, nobody could pronounce it. I'm not sure why. Most people stumbled over Phương, and I thought, let me just get rid of it. But now there are so many Lan Cao. But if I have kept Phương, it would have been, a little bit more unique. Yeah,
you need the whole name, because, like, for Viet Nguyen, for example, there are like murderers out there named Viet Nguyen. So you need the middle name for sure. But anyway, it's interesting that you brought up, your entire Vietnamese name and the way that it should be said and arranged, because I think even with one of our panelists today, I've discovered a name that I didn't know existed before. So that will be a part of our conversation, I think. Now, our next guest is Duong Van Mai Elliott, author of Sacred Willow, 4 Generations in the Life of a Vietnamese Family. And she was also an advisor with Ken Burns in the production of his documentary, The Vietnam War. Chị Mai was featured in 7 of the 9 episodes. Welcome, Chị Mai.
Chiều mưa biên giới anh đi về đâu? Sao còn đứng ngóng nơi giang đầu? Kia rừng chiều âm u rét mướt chờ ngày về.
Wow, I love that song just from that little snippet of it. Welcome, Chị Mai. Can you tell us the title of that song and why you picked it?
Yeah, it's a song called Chiều Mưa Biên Giới, and it is sung by the famous singer Ha Thanh. And this song was written by composer Nguyễn Văn Đông in 1956 when he was part of a campaign against the Hoa Hao religious sect. And he was at the border between Vietnam and Cambodia, and it was raining and cold, and he felt very sad and homesick, and he thought of his family being left behind. So anyway, even though it was written in 1956, it became extremely popular in the 60s, during the entire war, actually, because it evoked the sadness of the war, the suffering and the sacrifices of the combat soldiers who had to leave their family to go fight. And actually, Madame Nhu banned it at one point because she thought it was demoralizing the soldiers. So I pick it because it reminds me that April 30th, 1975, for all of its complexities and ambivalence and so on, it reminds me that it did put an end to the fighting, and it did put an end to the shooting and the killing and the destruction, and that it ended, the situation that made Chiều Mưa Biên Giới such a popular song, something that just spoke to so many Vietnamese who were tired of the war, who were fatigued, sad, and longed for a normal life. So I think that's why I chose it, just to remind us that war was very bad, and 75 did put an end to it. Although the consequences, the aftermath, is something we can discuss, because it did bring peace, but not peace to a lot of people as well. Exactly. So that's something that we can talk later.
We would definitely talk about it. Before we get to that, I wanted to ask you too about your name, Duong Van Mai Elliott. Did I pronounce that right? And is there a history behind the name that we need to know?
Yeah. Well, Lan Cao and you, I guess you faced the same issue I did when I wrote the book. I thought if I use Mai Elliott, people say, well, it's written by an American. Why should I read it? Well, what does she know about Vietnam? So at first I used Duong Van Mai, and then I thought, well, I'm not ashamed of my American name, so I used Duong Van Mai Elliott. And I didn't reverse my name. I didn't say Mai Van Duong, because I thought, well, my name is Duong Van Mai in Vietnamese, so I used Duong Van Mai Elliott for that reason. I think we all face that issue because of our name. How should we arrange it? Should we keep it the way it's written in Vietnamese, or should we change it to the way the Americans use their names with the last, our last name comes first, but in America, our last name comes last. So, we all face that issue, I guess.
Absolutely. Me too. I obviously go by Viet Thanh Nguyen. And I thought when I was going to be published in Vietnam, the Vietnamese people would just start calling me Nguyen Thanh Viet. But in fact, now my books are Viet Thanh Nguyen without the accent marks. They see me as a complete American, and I guess I deserve that fate. All right. Our next guest is Ly Hayslip. Now, Ly Hayslip is the author of 2 books, memoirs about her life, Child of When Heaven and Earth Change Places, and Child of War, Woman of Peace, both of which the director Oliver Stone adapted into his movie Heaven and Earth. Welcome, chị Ly.
Thank you, em.
Can you tell us what that song was and why you picked it?
I like vọng cổ, cải lương, and I also like hò khoan from Central Vietnam. So I don't think people would interest in that thing. So I just thought a very little of it. But if I have chance, I can sing you vọng cổ and hò khoan.
Yes, you have the chance to sing us a song, of course.
Yes.
Do you want to do it now, or you want to save it for later when we're all a little bit more tipsy?
Yeah, we're going to save it.
Okay, great. No, because I grew up with that stuff not that stuff. I grew up with that music in my house as well, obviously with my parents, and I think so many of us did, of our generation. So that has particular meaning for all of us. The Vietnamese blues, I guess some people have called it. Thank you. Oh yes, your name as well. I mean, I've been asking everybody about their names, and tell us a little bit about your name and the history of your name.
Yes, my name is Phong Thị Lệ Lý. But then when I came here, of course, just like on about, we wrap off our Vietnamese last name and adapted to my marriage name. First is Ly Monroe, then later I came to Ly Hayslip. And so when I signed the book in Vietnamese, I put in Phong Ly Hayslip. But when I signed it just for American, then I just wrap the Phong and I just use Ly Hayslip. And so I think we all Vietnamese have a common stress that somehow name it all messed up, first, last, Latin first. But the important thing that we know who we are, and the name is come with our face and our identity and our black hair and yellow skin. So I am proud to just keep that way.
Thank you, Chị Lê Lý. Our fourth guest is, and here's the person whose name I learned something new about today, Marcelino Truong. He's an illustrator, author, painter, the author of 2 graphic novels, Such a Lovely Little War and Saigon Calling, both based on the history of Vietnam in the years before 1975. He is coming to us from France.
How many roads must a man walk down before you call him a man? Yes, and how many seas must a white
And Marcelino, welcome. Tell us about the song.
Hi. Hello?
No, can you hear me?
You can hear me, okay.
Yes,
So,
can you tell us
well,
about the song that you picked?
Yes, of course, you all know this Bob Dylan song, Blowing in the Wind. This is the sort of music we would hear related to the Vietnam War when I lived in England after leaving Vietnam in 1963. And then I moved to France in 72. And most of the music related to the Vietnam War was obviously against the Vietnam War. And Bob Dylan was one of the most famous artists rebelling against that war. Now, this song doesn't exactly reflect my position at all, but this was very much in the air in my youth and in 1975 too in Europe.
And we were talking about names, and like I said, I learned something new about you today. I've always known you as Marcelino Truong, but now also Look as well. So can you tell us about the name and why now, all of a sudden, at least to me, introducing Look as well?
Well, because when I was born in 1957, my father being Vietnamese, and we all had Vietnamese nationality. It was only our mother who was French. But in those days, remember, this was in the days of Ngo Dinh Diem, and it was a form of nationalism for the state of Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, they expected you to have a Vietnamese first name. So we all had both a Western first name and a Vietnamese first name, and my first name was Look, because my parents, my father especially, tried to pick Vietnamese names which also had a meaning in French, and obviously Look in French is the apostle Luke. That's the meaning. That's the origin of my Vietnamese first name.
Thank you.
Which I rarely use, but I was glad to bring it out today.
Great. I'm glad too, to learn something new about you and about all of the history of our names and where we ended up and what that did to us in terms of the choices that we made. Before we get into April 30th, I want to bring out one final guest. That is our resident mixologist, Duong Van, who has concocted something special for us just for April 30th.
Hi everyone, it's good to see you. I'm Tui or Toi. And for tonight's cocktail, I made something called the Cyclist. And it's a tea and citrus-based cocktail that you can mix with gin or vodka. And it has jasmine tea, honey, lemon, and you can use either navel orange or blood orange. And you shake it up really well until it gets really frothy. And when you strain it into a cup, you'll see a layer of foam up top. So it's supposed to mimic beer. And the concept behind this drink was I was thinking about tonight's event and talking about dialectic or dualities and looking at things from multiple perspectives, which we'll do with April 30th and remembering the date. So I thought, well, how can I translate this into a drink? So I took my inspiration from trà đá or iced tea and beer, which are both refreshing drinks in Vietnam, and kind of combine them into one, kind of reconciling different ideas into one drink. So that's a little bit about the Cyclist and just the name choice. It comes from the word Radler, which is a German type of shandy. And Radler in German means cyclist. So that's the inspiration behind the cocktail. I hope you enjoy it. And if you're looking for the recipe, you can find it on my Instagram at Mixophoria.
Mixophoria on Instagram, and she does the most beautiful cocktails. I already drank part of mine, so it doesn't look quite as nice anymore, but it's delicious. Cheers! Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
So here we are talking about April 30th, and we've already gotten kind of a start. But let's talk about April 30th and what it means to each of you. You have such different historical and personal experiences, although you come from roughly the same generation, old enough to remember the history and the war and events that many people in the audience were not there themselves to witness. And let's start with Marcelino. I'm especially interested in your experience because you left Vietnam at an earlier age in 1963, and then you ended up in France. You're the only non-American or non-US based person on the panel, and I'm wondering if you can tell us what do you think about when you think about this day, April 30th?
Well, on April 30, 1975, I was 18 years old. I was doing my first year studying as a student in Paris at a school called ACCENTEDiRL Politiques, political science school. It's a pretty famous school in France. I was still Vietnamese at that time. I only became French the following year, and the atmosphere in France was very particular because France was on its way, was going along its way to the left wing in France was hoping to attain power and for a socialist president to be elected. This would only happen 6 years later in 1981. But in 1975, this left-wing atmosphere was quite strong. Many young people and many of, shall I say, to make things easy, all the cool people, all the nice, friendly people would be left-wing. It wasn't very easy to be anything else. And at that time in France, many people were even Maoist. France's finest intellectuals like Jean-Paul Sartre were openly Maoist, and many people followed about the Vietnamese story. Many people were of the same opinion as the French Communist Party. That was the prevalent interpretation of the events in Vietnam. So I had come from England in 1972, first in Brittany, and then when I got my baccalaureate, I moved on to Paris. And when I arrived in 1972, just try to imagine, this was only 4 years after May 68 in France, which was a big thing, as you know. And this leftist atmosphere was very strong, and many people were against what they call the American intervention. There was very little awareness of the fact that some Vietnamese might not share the view of the Vietnamese communists. They didn't exist. They were completely eclipsed by the overpowering American presence. And for many French people, they were pro-Hanoi or sympathetic to Hanoi, which was seen as the victim of the huge Goliath, you know, David struggling against the huge Goliath. And people kept and still do actually often reminding us all the time that Saigon was pro-American, and well, for completely ignoring the fact or deliberately conceding the fact that if Saigon was perhaps an ally of America, well, Hanoi was very pro-Peking and pro-Moscow. But this was never said, and still is not very often said. So I just wanted to brush the picture for you of France in 1975.
I think it's really important because obviously here in the United States, it's a deeply anti-communist country, and most of the people who've come here, came as a result of fleeing as refugees in 1975 and have brought anti-communist feelings with them, and that's dominated the public conversation here in the United States. But in France, I know it's obviously different, as you said, and that even in the Vietnamese community or the French of Vietnamese descent community in France, there is at least some left-wing feeling, and there's more diversity of opinion, it seems to me, in France than you would find here in the United States among the Vietnamese Americans. Do you think that's fair?
Probably, yes. Paris was the capital in Europe where both Vietnamese community coexisted. And I suppose this was an original aspect of France. What I must insist on is that this Maoist current in French left-wing politics was extremely strong when I arrived. Remember, Jean-Paul Sartre had created a newspaper called La Cause du Peuple, the cause of the people's cause. And this paper was extremely left-wing, extremely Maoist, and he was the moral leader of the intellectual left. And the trouble was that they really believed that the People's Republic of China was the perfect thing for Asia, and they only began to sober up. It was almost like a headiness, you know. They were enamored and drunk with Mao, and they only began to sober up after 1975, when news started to filter out of Cambodia about the Khmer Rouge, and later and all simultaneously about the boat people in Vietnam. But it was a very special atmosphere. I remember when I was at Lycée in St. Malo in Brittany, because my mother was from Saint-Malo, St. Malo in Brittany. That's where I live now. I just did my last 2 years of Lycée in St. Malo. It was a big change for me from London. Now, in that school in St. Malo, in that public, well, you know, the Lycée d'État, the public school, not a public school, but the state school, one of the teachers there was a very nice French teacher, and she was Maoist, and she really, and to please her, when I return to London, I'd go to this place in Soho, this Chinese bookshop where they sold Chinese propaganda posters, those very well done, very well made Chinese propaganda posters, and I'd buy them. They would cost nothing, and I'd bring a few back to her. And when she would open them, the roll of posters, she would really be convinced that what was shown on those posters was the truth. And she was ecstatic about how healthy the children looked and how happy everyone looked. You know, those smiles on Chinese propaganda posters? And I found that extremely worrying. This was a lady who had done 3 years of university studies, and she was convinced that this propaganda was the truth. So I thought to myself, our position as shall I say, non-communist Vietnamese is going to be difficult here, because there was something wrong in their heads. They went too far in their they were enamored with a utopia and something which had no link to reality. And this was the prevalent current in French leftist politics.
At least at the end, Jean-Paul Sartre came around and actually publicly advocated for the French to accept the refugees from Vietnam, despite their affiliations with what he might perceive to be a problematic regime. But Lê Ly, you were in Vietnam for much of this. You weren't there for April 30th itself, but you grew up during this time period of war, as you talked about in both of your memoirs very, very powerfully. I assume that you were watching April 30th, the events at with the end of the war from the United States. What do you think about when this day comes around? You're muted.
Very much nervous when you're talking about April 30th. Two part of me that went through a very tough time in those days. I was 25 years old, mother of two, and carry my youngest son now is 45. And I was here in San Diego. I sent my husband to Vietnam to get my sister. And now on 28th of April, he's still not back, heard nothing from him. And I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, and I just like a nervous wreck and was crying and just thought that he dead. On the other side of me, that I was so happy to see the war end, went through what I went through, saw what I saw, and the war end, that it happy for Vietnamese, happy for American, happy for everybody. But when I get up outside and talk to my neighbors, who is most of the navies, who the husband still in Vietnam or already come back here, they say, no, we have to go and get the red communists out. We cannot let red common take over the South. I mean, on, and I thought, wow, you know, it's just like a half of it, the war end, that is what everybody wanted. But another half would say, no, the war cannot be end unless the South win the war. And here where is my husband and my sister and everybody just like cut off completely. And that was when April 30 come, I can be crying or I can be, you know, happy to see the war end. So that feeling is never left me. But when I live here by myself, never really go outside and watch the news, then I'm not really too much see or know what's going on. But if I happen to be outside where the community, Vietnamese community or little Saigon, it's just like April 30 all over again. It's just a very emotional feeling, and it's very distressed to see how intense and how up in the air with hatred and with upsetting, and it's just very mixed feeling for me every time that April 30 come around. And even though that 46 years is a long time, but that feeling it never go away.
Right. I think that's true. I mean, I think so many people who came from Vietnam, who lived through this time period, or even people who are the children of people who lived through this time period, always report the intensity of their emotions. Have you been to any of the April 30th commemorations in the Vietnamese American community?
Me?
Yeah,
You want to get killed? They kill me if I go there. Yeah. No, I don't dare to go there. When my mother and sister came over here in 1973 when the movie premiered, and I took them there for Tet celebration. And as soon as they found out that I was there, they chased us out so fast, and they really harassed my mom, and she almost fainted. And it got very mean. I mean, when she saw the South Vietnamese flag and the uniform that they parade, she begged me, please take me out of here, take me out of there. But it's so crowded, I couldn't take her out. Then the mob over and attack her so badly. I just feel so horrible because, here she an old lady, she almost 80. And my two older sisters, they also old, but oh my God, I never forget those days. So every time the April 30 or Vietnamese test, I stay away the Vietnamese community because to me, I'm just like a tiger bring to the jaws of the midge bring to the jaws of the tiger. That is how they see me at a Vietnamese here.
I don't know if everybody in the audience knows the history of Lê Ly's work, but the first book, When Heaven and Earth Changed Places, I believe was published in 1989, and then the Oliver Stone film came out a few years later in the early 90s. And so for a time, Lê Ly was probably the most famous Vietnamese person in the United States, with the success of the memoirs and then the Oliver Stone movie. And it was not without controversy in the Vietnamese American community due to some of the stories that you talked about in your memoir. So that is what I think you're referring to, that there are some apparently a lot of Vietnamese Americans who hold some of your stories against you. And I think that is one of the other connotations of April 30th, at least in the United States, that some of the passions are so strong around this day that the nationalism and the anti-communism continues, and any kind of deviation or suspected deviation from anti-communism becomes suspect, and even more than suspect, can become attacked, as in your case. I think it's important to acknowledge that. Now, Chị Mai, you were also there during the years of the war, and you were, actually, you were part of the Rand Institute, I believe it was called, doing research studies in South Vietnam around the war and around the National Liberation Front. So you had a very close view of what was going on, and then you came to the United States. I don't know if you were in the United States on April 30th or not, but what does April 30th mean to you?
The collapse on TV, and I couldn't believe what was happening. It happened so fast. But anyway, for me, April 30th, 1975, is the day when my family broke up. We were very close. I was in the U.S., and a brother and a sister were in France, but the rest of the family, I come from a large family. So anyway, the sister was in Hanoi, but the rest of the family lived in Saigon, and they got together every week. And then suddenly, April 30th, 1975, they fled, and after that, they chose to resettle in different countries. So some went to France, one went to Canada, some stay in the US, went one to Australia, and some in Vietnam didn't get out, couldn't get out for a long time, and some are still there. So to me, April 30th always reminds me of how my family broke up. And now I have to travel all over the world to see them. And at that time, it was extremely traumatic for them, of course, as it was for everybody who fled at that time. And the future was very uncertain, and they didn't know what was going to happen to them. I didn't know what was going to happen to them. So April 30th always brings back the sense of family breakup, the uncertainties of life. In one couple of days, the ground was cut from underneath them, and they were all dispersed, and their life was turned upside down, and they had to rebuild, and so on. So And another thing that I think of when I think of April 30th is although Vietnam eventually after that became physically reunified after years of division at the 17th parallel, but it also was a day of deep division, as Ly was describing the Vietnamese Americans in Little Saigon. And that division still lasts to this day. And, the winners in Vietnam call it the Day of Liberation, but the people of Lower Saigon call it the Day of Ngày Quốc Hận, the Day of national anger and hatred. So it's a day of division, and it's still a day of division, I think. And I think things are getting better. We'll get into that, but that's what I think of when I think of April 30th, 1975.
Well, of course, the term that many Vietnamese Americans have adopted for April 30th is to call it Black April in English. What do you think of that term?
Black April?
Black April.
Yeah, I think that means it's a day of darkness for them. Like not just for them, but for the country. Like a darkness fell over South Vietnam when the communists came in, and it just describes how they think about that day. It still rankles with them. I think Viet, you wrote a book about how war never ends and that it continues to be fought in people's memories. And I think April 30th, for a lot of Vietnamese Americans, is still being fought over. Is it liberation or is it national hatred and anger? And so I think it's just the terms that describe how they feel about it. It's a day of darkness that fall over South Vietnam.
By the end of our conversation, we'll get to this issue of the possibility of reconciliation, if it's possible to bridge the differences between a day of liberation and a day of anger and sorrow and loss, as some in the Vietnamese diaspora would recall it. Now, Chị Lan, you were there too, there, and your own family history is also really interesting because your father was a very famous general in the South Vietnamese Army. So you had a very particular experience of going through this war. So what does April 30th mean to you?
Well, it certainly means a sense of loss for me because we fled. I mean, it's not like we stayed and celebrated. So clearly we fled. I don't have a kind of ideologically driven view of April 30th or of the war. And I think part of it is because everybody who is directly related to me, basically in my family, had some role to play in the war. As you already mentioned, my father was he was in the airborne and was a commander of the airborne brigade. And that's what he identified with. He saw that as part of his primary identity. And I have an uncle who was Viet Cong, who was in the same cell as I think somebody, Vo Van Kiek, or another Southerner, who later became after the war somebody very high-ranking, maybe even prime minister. I don't know. So I grew up with my uncle. I call him Ba Nam, so father number 5. And then I have another uncle who was a mine sweeper and was blown up, sweeping mines in the south, I think in the Mekong Delta. So they're very kind of, human stories. And even though my uncle was in the National Liberation Front, or the Viet Cong, he stayed in touch with the family. And his son was raised because he didn't raise the son himself, he was in the jungle. So the rest of the family raised him. But he stayed in touch, and he would clandestinely come visit in the family holidays and things like that. There was a lot of talk about the war and what it meant and the divisions. So for me, it's definitely a day of loss when we left. And ironically, my uncle Banam even, kind of warned us that the day was coming, that his side was winning, and it would behoove us to leave and not to stay behind. I think maybe the divisions in the diaspora might be lessened. I think, of course, we hold on to the past, but maybe it would not be expressed in the way it has been expressed if conditions in Vietnam had been different after 75, right? If there was a different construction of a post-war society, I think the diaspora would still be very sad because we're not there anymore. But I think some of it is not just a holdover from the past, but also a kind of a sadness, very deep sadness over what has happened since, quote, peace officially came to Vietnam. I mean, and we can talk about this later, but I've returned to Vietnam and many times teaching the young generation, and I get a very strong sense talking with them, the law students, about April 30th to them as well.
Wow, what do they say? I mean, because one thing that I often hear from younger Vietnamese people in Vietnam is that they have a very particular version of history that they get in school, obviously, and I don't know what April 30th is taught as Reunification Day or Liberation Day and all that. So what do they say when you tell them your version of April 30th?
Well, the reason why I'm allowed to go back to Vietnam and teach so often, I go to Hanoi National University and also the equivalent university in the South, is because I teach a very seemingly non-ideological subject, right? I teach corporate law, I teach contract law, things that the government approves of because it brings in foreign investment. I teach trade law, and since Vietnam has ratified the WTO and become part of the WTO, they're very interested in this. So all of my lectures attract students who basically want to make it in the market economy, in the capitalist economy. But what's very interesting is that all laws of the kind that I'm introducing are about dispersed power. So even corporate law, the American version of corporate law allows an individual shareholder to sue vertically up a director, whereas the Vietnamese securities law only allows, let's say, the securities, like the equivalent of the SEC, to sue a company. So the idea that a mere individual, in the peanut gallery can actually sue somebody higher up is very, very, actually very radical. And through that conversation, this is how we talk about 1975, right? Because I would not dare talk about like 1975 and April 30. But through that, you weave in the notion that individuals have rights, not just entities and not just institutions or not just state-owned enterprises. And they will talk with me after class. A lot of them stay after class. They all use the word "Giải phóng" because I think that's just like a that they use without really thinking about what it means. But I can say that since Formosa has created all this pollution along the coast of Vietnam, the sentiment of being very unhappy with what's going on with the government is much more expressed. I just listen to it. I don't even join in because I've been warned, like don't participate, even though it may look like they're all for human rights and whatnot. It could be a plant. But anyway, I discuss all of this with them, but all in terms of rule of law. Mm-hmm. And they are very interested. They're very idealistic, the young people, and they are super duper interested in reconciliation. Mm-hmm. And not because they're victors, because there are people who want to reconcile. And it's easy to reconcile when you're the winner. But I don't get that from, these are 17, 18-year-old, 19-year-old students who are very respectful and just yearning for knowledge and yearning for critical knowledge, not memorizing, not kind of like top-down knowledge. Mm-hmm. And it has given me a tremendous sense of joy going back there and interfacing with the young.
I find it very funny, of course, that in a communist country like Vietnam, it's considered non-ideological to teach corporate law.
Yes.
So it's like, okay, that makes perfect sense to me.
State capitalism.
We'll get to the question of reconciliation probably in the Q&A with the audience. So audience out there, please send us your questions in the chat. After the break, we'll get to the audience questions, which I hope also will include these issues of what has changed. What are the possibilities of reconciliation? What about new generations and their different relationships to April 30th and everything that it represents, both in Vietnam and also in the diaspora as well. But the last question I want to end with in this final round is this question of representation, because all of you are, very interestingly became writers and artists. And of course, the stereotype for Vietnamese people in the United States, I'm not sure if it's the same in France, is that we become doctors and lawyers and engineers because that's what we're supposed to do. And yet here are all of you all decided to write books or create art. And of course, you all have dealt with this history that we've just been discussing, and you're in France or in the United States. And there is a dominant version of the history of Vietnam and the war and colonialism as done by the French or by the Americans. And here you are, Vietnamese people or people of Vietnamese descent, however you choose to characterize yourself, coming along with your stories focused on Vietnamese people. Do you think that we have been successful collectively as Vietnamese people in changing the way that the United States and France have chosen to represent this history? Let's start with you, Jilei Ly. What do you think?
I think it is just a perfect way to share this little world. Because without April 1975, we wouldn't be here to give the world our knowledge, our experience, good or bad or different. That is why I think the younger generation, it will be the best place to write, read, educate it, and share. Because so many young people, just like you say, Viet, is so smart, like yourself. You think you have that same chance if you're still in Vietnam. Many of us here today, would we have a same chance today that we have if we stay in Vietnam or South Vietnam win or something? We're only looking for positive. We're looking for something for the future, for the better. We cannot turn our back history. It's gone. It's finished for 46 years. We cannot do anything about the past. But with younger generation, with your generation, your children generation, and my grandchildren generation, they're the one who will benefit. And we all benefit from what being here. It was a sad day. It was a very emotional day. Everybody knows that, but it healed. Time is healing. And so I hope and pray that more and more Vietnamese overseas can able to express themselves more, writing, painting, whatever they're going to do to contribute the healing at the same time that to bring Vietnam where it needs to be. Still a lot of need of help. There's still poor. There's still a lot of landmine, the age noise, all the problem that Vietnam has to deal with. That is what now American or the friend or another country can come and share. Have been done for last 35 years, but still a lot more to need to get done. So April 30 is bad, and yes, it positively so many young, talented, wealthy Vietnamese here. And that's what I see that it's a very honor to have it here.
Thanks, Jilei Ly. Ji Mai, what do you think? Have we been successful at all in shifting the way that our France and the United States have thought about this history?
I think that the condition right now are more conducive to getting our voices heard. And, thanks to people like you, Viet, your prominence has helped a lot in raising the profile of Vietnamese Americans in the United States. And but I think that we still have a long way to go, because when I have the feeling that when Americans think about the Vietnam War, they still think of it as an American war. They think about the American soldiers who went there. They think about the battles that the American soldiers fought. That's why I was so thankful that when Ken Burns did his documentary on the Vietnam War, he included a lot of Vietnamese people in it, a lot of Vietnamese voices. But when it comes to depicting the Vietnam War, Vietnamese most of the time still play a secondary role. The most recent movie that you critique in the New York Times, Das Five Bloods, you know, it's about Americans going back to Vietnam, but they're all reliving their own experiences, and Vietnam was just the background and Vietnamese were just secondary characters. So I think that we've come a long, long way thanks to all of you. But I think there's still a lot, you know, for us to do in order to raise our profiles, and I mean the profiles of Vietnamese Americans or French Vietnamese, so that we can break through all the clutter and all the other voices that can drown us out. Just because the public is more interested in what America and Americans did in Vietnam than what South Vietnamese did, or what happened to South Vietnamese civilians. Maybe they know something about that because of My Lai. But how about the North Vietnamese? They you know, they have this idea, but they don't really go below all these ideas to find out what it was really like, or what the truth could have been. So I think that we've done a good job, but we still have a long way to go. That's my feeling.
Thank you, Jimai. Lan, what do you think? Have we been able to budge the American and French?
Yes, of course we've been able to budge, but I can tell you, when I think about how Vietnam is viewed, is depicted, is portrayed, the thing that comes to mind immediately to me is the movie, which is very celebrated and it irks me to death, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, in which just gratuitously, you know, they inserted Bruce Lee in there, created some straw man version of him, and then have him be like, you know, totally demolished by like a cocky Brad Pitt, right? And I'm thinking, why was that even done? How is that necessary to take like practically the only Asian male iconic person that we have that is recognizable around the world? Because not only are Asian women represented in a very problematic way, you know, I mean, like the dichotomy between the dragon lady or the one who's going to sacrifice herself and throw herself onto a sword for a white guy, and she's yearning for him when he departs. So that's the Western portrayal of the female. And then the Western portrayal of the Asian male is like, you know, like the white guy is the standard, and the Asian guy is feminized, and the black man is like threatening and overly masculine. And we have Bruce Lee is the only person, okay? And he had to be taken down in this movie. And it's just emblematic to me of why gratuitously you have to do that. And that is how Vietnam is done, you know, when it's portrayed by America, kind of like a side story. You're all stupid, or you're just irrelevant, you're peripheral. We would have won the war if we had had better allies, you're corrupt. I mean, it just fits into so many pre-existing narratives. And it's not just Vietnam. In fact, if you see any movies at all, even when the movie, you know, let's say it's about some other country, the main character who is going to have an epiphany is going to be a white character, and it's some background event in a nondescript country that triggers his consciousness. So in many ways, you know, Vietnam is a catalyst for whatever America wants. It could be, you know, to further a kind of Rambo view of American power, or a more conciliatory view of, you know, a more, you know, dovish, not hawkish America, but it's all the same. And when I saw that movie and how they created that tear down of Bruce Lee, it is the American view of Vietnam. You can put Bruce Lee in there, and it's just like, okay, you thought you were so great. Brad Pitt, who's not even like a real martial artist, I can, you know, kick the heck out of you.
I would respond, except I haven't watched Once Upon a Time in Hollywood precisely because of what you have just described, Lan. But I guess I'm going to have to if I want to be able to pitch in here. Let's end with Marcelino. You know, coming from France, and we've heard 3 Vietnamese American perspectives, and I think the whole world knows how the United States has talked about the war in Vietnam because of American global power with Hollywood and all the American movies that we export. But France has its own version of this history. You know, I remember watching movies like The Lover and Lan Indochine with Catherine Deneuve way back in the early 90s, and it seemed to present a certain kind of romanticized version of the French history in Vietnam. And that still seems to be kind of dominant, because when I was in France, my perception was that the French don't really spend that much time thinking about so-called Indochina, and if they do, it's with this romanticized version, and they get to blame the Americans for doing the really evil things in Vietnam. Is that right? And you know, how are the French of Vietnamese descent? Are the French of Vietnamese descent at all concerned about that? And are they like you, trying to tell a different version of that history?
I'm glad you used the word romanticized, because as I was saying earlier on, when I arrived in France, I felt they had a very romanticized vision of the communist side. They had a very demonized vision of the South and a very romanticized vision of the North, or the National Liberation Front. To go back to what you were saying, those films you mentioned, Indochine and L'Amant, indeed present a very romanticized vision of the colonial period. There's a sort of reluctance in France, still going on today, to talk about the colonial period, because there's a sort of feeling of embarrassment or guilt sometimes concerning that era. I often think it's not a good thing, and films should be made, more films, more books about that colonial period, and perhaps we could hope to move away from the binary vision that was very prevalent during the war years. The subject of Indochina or Vietnam wars, the Indochina or Vietnam wars, is usually occupied by the extreme left or the extreme right in France. It's a sort of intellectual battleground between both those extremes. There aren't many people in the middle ground. I often say that when you study these subjects in France, you always hit the extreme right or the extreme left sooner or later. You'll soon get there. And I find that a great pity, because none of these sides possess the whole story. As Lan was saying, in our families, in our Vietnamese families, we often have people, very close relatives, who were on the other side. And I find that a great source of understanding. My understanding of the Vietnam War, I think, evolved greatly when I went back to Vietnam for the first time in 1991. And who greeted me at the airport? It was a close cousin of my father's called Ly Truong, who was a Vietnamese intellectual in the South, and who in 1975 came out as a supporter, a clandestine supporter of the National Liberation Front. Now, it was very interesting for me to have long chats with him. I spent hours with him. He spoke extremely fluent French and was a very cultured and learned man, very pleasant guy. And so was my father, who held the opposed views. although very opposed but very enlightened too. Not at all comment on dit, un anticommuniste primaire, a basic anti-communist. No, not at all. So both those sides existed in our family, and knowing what the other side believed was interesting for me, and I think this is something we can add to the debate, because we're neither extreme left or extreme right. We have both in our families, and our generation can maybe reconcile those 2 points of view, because we know the people behind those ideologies. I find that that generation was very valiant and idealistic too. I liked them all. They were all good people. They chose, they did what they thought was best after much hesitation, I'm sure. And knowing that these were kind and humane people, and courageous and hardworking, and they maintained a link, as Lan said, during the war. They would meet in secret around Tet usually, because usually their mothers would say, "Listen, leave your political views aside and let's get together and forget about all that." And they achieved that. And we still do. We communicate in spite of the political differences. So I think that our voices, it's about time our voices were heard more, because I'm very annoyed often in France when I am lectured about my own history, either by right-wing French people or left-wing French people. They're very good at that. And I find it extremely annoying to be lectured. When I was born in this, even though I didn't spend many years in Vietnam, this was the backdrop of all my youth. My father was very concerned by these things, and we would follow the news. And after 75, my grandparents and half of the family was still living in Vietnam. We would send parcels. Anyway, I don't like being lectured about that subject, and I think it's about time we spoke out. In France, the Vietnamese have this reputation, I think they deserve, of being a discreet community, hardworking, very loyal. You won't find them protesting much, which is I find very a good thing. But perhaps this discretion sometimes it would be time to speak out a bit more.
We need some angry French people of Vietnamese descent, I think, is partly what I'm hearing. And well, Marcelino, my novel The Committed is partly about what you just talked about, being lectured to by French people about Vietnamese history and politics. So we'll see what the French think when it comes out in French translation. Thank you all for your insights, your contributions, your feelings, and sharing. I think the audience has been really moved when I look at the comments here, that what people are saying. We're going to take a break. Philip is going to tell us what's going to happen.
Right. Thank you so much, Viet, and thank you so much to all of our guests for today, for our conversation so far. We still have a little bit left. We've got a book spotlight with the Diacritics editor. We've got some shout outs for Eastwind Books of Berkeley, and we've got a couple of questions during the Q&A that we want to ask the panelists for today. And we also want to ask Viet why why he won't use the word Black April in anything that he does, right? So definitely stay tuned. We're going to be getting to the Q&A and the latter portion of this conversation soon. Until then, I'm here to also remind y'all that, as we're talking about how accessible this conversation is, right? Hopefully y'all ask some questions in the chat that we'll bring up later. We want to be able to use Accented and ACCENTEDiRL as a teaching tool. So please, this is your chance to engage with our guests. Until then, I'm going to queue up DJ Puzzle, who will be spinning some Viet old school jams until we come back. So DJ Puzzle.
cho không gian tràn ngập âm thanh, cho tim em tràn ngập màu xanh, màu xanh. Hãy đàn lên cho sức sống vang lên lời ca, cho tuổi trẻ không bao giờ xa nhiệt tình. Đàn hay lên tiếng nói sống phải yêu đời, đàn thấy nhung sôi lên bao phong màu nóng, đàn thấy sắc kinh với bao người đi xây những công trình tương lai để quê hương đẹp giàu. Đàn thấy góp hết những giai điệu yêu thương gửi cho người biên cương giúp quê hương hòa bình. Hãy đàn lên cho chim muôn về đầu cây xanh, như tim em về đầu tình anh, tình anh. Hãy đàn lên cho tiếng hát em bay thật xa, cho tiếng nói yêu thương vượt qua mọi miền. Đàn hay lên tiếng nói sống phải yêu đời, đàn thấy nhung sôi lên bao phong màu nóng, đàn thấy sắc kinh với bao người đi xây những công trình tương lai để quê hương đẹp giàu. Đàn thấy góp hết những giai điệu yêu thương gửi cho người biên cương giúp quê hương hòa bình. Hãy đàn lên
มาแวะกินส้มตำได้อายส้มตำแซ่บแซ่บจากเย็นไปจนยันคืนคอยที่ปั๊มปากซอยน้องนาขายส้มตำหนุ่มแท็กซี่รูปหล่อและหนุ่มสามล้อมาอุดหนุนประจำแต่คืนนี้ยังไม่เห็นพี่มาแต่คืนนี้ยังไม่เห็นพี่มาหรือว่าพี่ยาเปลี่ยนที่กินส้มตำส้มตำน้องคงไม่อร่อยไม่เหมือนแถวซอยสุทธิสารตรอกตามหนุ่มแท็กซี่เลยเพื่ออาจไปติดสาวเนื้อที่ขายเพียงคำหนุ่มสามล้อก็ไม่เห็นมีแววหนุ่มสามล้อก็ไม่เห็นมีแววเคยมาจีบเจลเจลแต่คืนนี้เงียบงำแม่ค้าส้มตำอีสานหัวใจไว้หวั่นเสียคนในหัวคำหนุ่มแท็กซี่ไม่มากินส้มตำหนุ่มสามล้อก็ไม่มาเยี่ยมยามแม่ค้าส้มตำน้อยใจเรือลาจากเย็นกระทั่งจวนสว่างน้องเฝ้าแนมทางแต่ไม่เห็นพี่ชายเคยส่งเคยรับกลับบ้านคืนนี้มีฝันเป็นอย่างห่างหายหนุ่มแท็กซี่ที่ไม่มากลับกลายหนุ่มสามล้อบนก็จางห่างหายมันเจ็บในใจเลยไม่ค่าส้มตำ
Trời yêu thay trời bắt nhau vui
không ai coi xem lỗi nơi ai. Anh ra đi, anh đã ra đi, anh đi theo duyên mới xa xôi. Bang bang, anh đã ra đi. Bang bang, em sẽ bơ vơ. Bang bang, tiếng súng khi xưa. Bang bang, ta sẽ không quên bao giờ. Nay khi ta ra chốn công viên, trông bao nhiêu em bé hân hoan. Chơi công an đi bắt quân gian, chơi đi theo đi trốn lang xăng. Bang bang, ta nhớ năm xưa. Bang bang, trong trái tim ta. Bang bang, tiếng súng khi xưa. Bang bang, ta sẽ không quên bao giờ.
Shout outs and thank you so much to DJ Puzzle, Accented's in-house DJ. Please show some love to DJ Puzzle in the chat. Cheers. Thank you, Puzzle, for spinning during our cocktail break. Next, I'm going to bring up the author of the forthcoming novel, which is being released later next week, actually, Eric Nguyen, who is also our Diacritics editor. He's the author of Things We Lost to the Water, and he's going to let us know what our Diacritics book spotlight for this show is. Eric?
Hi, everyone. I'm Eric Nguyen. I am the editor-in-chief of Diacritics. We publish creative writing, stories, poetry, essays from the Vietnamese and Southeast Asian diaspora. I'm also the author of Things We Lost to the Water. You can see it there, which comes out on Tuesday. My recommendation for this week is Mango and Peppercorns by Tung Nguyen, Catherine Manning, and Lin Nguyen. Mango and Peppercorns is the story of Tung Nguyen, who leaves Vietnam during the fall of Saigon, entering the U.S. through Pennsylvania, where she becomes pregnant out of wedlock. She eventually leaves for Miami, where she is taken in by Catherine Manning. At first, the two women butt heads, but once Catherine tastes Tung's food, the two open Hy Vọng, a Vietnamese restaurant. Mango and Peppercorns chronicles the rise of their business. Throughout the book, we learn of how Tung comes to her recipes, as well as how she, Catherine, as well as her daughter, Lynn, build a unique family. Full of recipes and stories of finding one's place in a new country, this hope-filled memoir is a great addition to the history of Vietnamese American memoirs and for fans of the Netflix shows The Chef's Table. The book is Mango and Peppercorns.
Thank you so much, Eric, for that spotlight, and congratulations on your book coming out next Tuesday. We'll also have Eric on Accented IRL for our last iteration of Accented IRL in 2 weeks. All right, y'all. So I'm one more shout out quickly to our bookstore partner, Eastwind Books of Berkeley. Eric's book spotlight for today, as well as all of the works of the authors that y'all have had a chance to listen to today, will be on asiabookcenter.com, available from Eastwind Books of Berkeley. Eastwind Books of Berkeley, our bookstore partner, at a discounted rate, because I know y'all love discounts, and especially on today, right, when we're talking about April 30th. I also want to do a quick shout out for Eastwind Books Berkeley and the Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies program at UC Berkeley. Next week on Friday at 7:30 p.m. PST, we'll be hosting a conversation on The Committed with Viet Thanh Nguyen, as well as our guest Nguyen Phan Mai, who's here in the chat right now, Francois Jiao, who is the narrator of Viet's book on Audible and other audiobooks, and Kim Lee, who is one of the producers for his upcoming show, which maybe he'll talk about next week. So be sure to check that out. I'm going to go ahead and bring back our guests for tonight for the Q&A portion. So hopefully y'all have some questions in the chat to make my job a little bit easier. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. Hopefully y'all are also enjoying the cocktails from Thuy. Is Viet back? One of the first questions that I have and I want to ask you all, I mean, I think me as a second generation, both my parents are refugees that came here to the United States in the late 80s. I know this day as a day of mourning and sadness. And I know when I think about mourning and sadness, I think of this term Diasporic, right? But in the times that we Diasporic, we oftentimes have lessons learned, right? That one generation passes on to the next. And as we're reflecting on the past, I think I would want to think that, all the people that are listening with us are passing on this knowledge that they're gaining onto the future. Jimmy Patel Nguyen asked the question, as a son of Vietnamese refugees and the father of 2 boys, I often worry that our Vietnamese identity will fade with every generation. My question to this group, what should future generations always remember about our Vietnamese heritage? I will pitch this one first to Go Lê Ly, if you don't mind.
I think the best is to bring them back to Vietnam once in a while to make sure that they have connection with the ancestors and the country. And the secondly, that of course teach them anything that you know of, or share with them what there are books, movie about the history and about the culture and about the tradition, and especially on a woman, how the Vietnamese woman can carry not only the work through the whole of her life, but carry children over here, help to raise them, and hold everything together. I think that is what they need to know. Thank you.
Thank you, Go Lê Ly. And especially, I think Jimmy's question talks about being a son of Vietnamese refugees and as a father. And I think your pivot to Vietnamese women in the story and struggle of Vietnamese women is so poignant. I'll pass it on to Go Mai, if you wouldn't mind, talking about what you think future generations should always remember about our Vietnamese heritage.
Going back, if possible, take them back to Vietnam or encourage them to go back if they can be there on their own. And telling them about your own family history. And I think this is a project that I've been encouraging Vietnamese Americans to do, which is to talk about with their parents and record their stories, learn more about the family background, not just when you arrive in the US, but way back there, and I think that's all very important. And maybe you can record your own memories or tell them your own memories of what you remember. And I think it's, if they have this family record, I think that would anchor them to the country. I know that in Vietnam, for example, in my family, we kept a Zapha, a family history that is passed on from generation to generation, so that we know about not only the family continuity, but about the summary history. Because when it talks about what the various people do, talk about their education, their career, their postings, their achievements, it gives a background of the family. And I think that that's something that children can relate to. And I think that that's very important. And I hope everybody, every Vietnamese overseas will do that. And that's something that I've talked a lot to Vietnamese Americans, to encourage them to talk to their parents and learn more about them and their families. Sometimes parents don't want to talk about Vietnam. They don't want to talk about the past because it's so painful. But it's imperative that the children ask the parents to talk about these things.
Right. Thank you so much for that, Go Mai. And I just want to highlight this comment from Anastasia Lay, who mentions that her Vietnamese peers in the Asian American Studies Department at Berkeley, who are of the second and third generation, are continuing to actively grapple with their shared history. And it might not just be this lack of interest in this history, but this gap in the sort of dedicated spaces for them to create a sort of community, right? And for us, our community still runs strong. We still got almost 150 people here on the stream. What about you and Marcelino? What is something that you'd want to pass on about Vietnamese history and heritage to future generations?
Well, I do this with my graphic novels and also with picture books for young readers I did in the past. I do my best. I have 3 children, two girls and a boy, and I think that sometimes they think I overdo it a bit, and that you must understand that I'm half French, so it's the Vietnamese side is more diluted, and that my children don't necessarily feel the need to find great interest in Vietnamese customs and history. I think I can't force feed them, but they hear me enough, and they sometimes joke about me going on and on about this, which I certainly do. I do try to keep a trace of the enlarged family, especially of its history, which was passed on to me by my father, who got it from his mother, Banoi. That I try to do. I'm not sure, for the moment, it doesn't really fascinate my children, who are adults already, but maybe later they will need to, or feel the urge to learn more about this part of the family. We of course, I have this fascination for Vietnamese food too. I cook, and this I pass on. This is a way of passing on the culture. And I think that in my upbringing, in spite of the fact that mother was French, I had a very Vietnamese upbringing, because my father was let's call him a modern traditionalist, but he really brought us up the way he thought well brought up Vietnamese children should be educated. That was very strong. But, well, I do my best, but sometimes it's not possible to, the danger is to overdo it sometimes, for me anyway, with my mixed children.
I'll pass it over. Thank you so much for that, Marcelino. And I think I feel that way too. Like growing up, if my parents inundated me with the knowledge that they wanted me to know, then it pushed me further away from them, right? And so I think it's about finding that happy balance between what you mentioned earlier about lecturing, right, and teaching, right, or learning. Golang, I know that you have a book that was recently released with your daughter. I mean, could you talk a little bit about that in the way that you pass on your heritage and history to her and got her involved and interested in what you do and talk about?
That was more of a deliberate and concentrated effort where we're participating in a project together, which had its own up and down and a lot of turbulence. Anytime you collaborate with somebody, you have a different vision, and it creates tension. But to collaborate on something that is so raw with your own daughter, who was a teenager when you first started the book, is, you can imagine, quite incendiary. But for me, really, because I have only one child, and I do want to impart the Vietnamese part of her heritage to her. What I've done, I think, is that I do it because I'm all about the census. I'm much less about history or ideology or political positions, although I do have it, but it's not dominant for me. So I try to share with her things that are very everyday. There's no lecture, there's nothing to impart really, and I have found that she's much more willing to listen. So, for example, when I tell her about like smell, I bring up Vietnam through smell with her, like nước mắm. And to share my history, I talked about how, when I went to high school, my parents wanted to pack Vietnamese food in a lunchbox for me, and how that became a kind of bullying moment for me because it was very pungent. And so, the idea of how smell can bring up a certain experience, right? I share that with her. So it becomes just a kind of like a normal sharing of my childhood with her. And I cite, I remember, and this goes to a little bit about Viet's feeling about Black April. I always thought that white is the color of mourning. And I told my daughter, for example, that, when I was growing up, we had mosquito nettings and there was always white. And my parents kept telling me, when you crawl into bed, do not let the white mosquito netting touch your head, because they were superstitious. And they think if it touches your head, you'll be wearing like a headband, a mourning headband, and that's just going to trigger bad luck. So, I tell her about the color of mourning in Vietnam, M-O-U-R-I-N-I-N-G, not M-O-R-N-I-N-G, and why it's white and how it's white. Hearing, 6 tones in Vietnamese. I've only been able to do 5 tones, and I remember when Viet was talking about how do we pronounce our names. Your last name is Nguyen, but it's a dấu ngã, and most Southerners can't even make the dấu ngã. So we have a lot of fun playing with the 6 tones and what each tone means. So when I try to impart Vietnamese heritage to her, it's really through very tiny drops of details that evoke the 5 senses whenever it comes up. Like if it comes up, I bring it up and I incorporate any of my personal memory, either it be about the war or something about Vietnamese food, or the rain and the monsoon in Vietnam, bring those kinds of things in so that it's kind of like imparting a mother tongue. It's like your mother's milk. It's not information, it's not data, it's not knowledge. It's from the inside coming out. So that's what I try to do. And I take her to Vietnam. And I think that's created a pretty good connective tissue with the past for her. And I want her to form her own opinion about what she thinks about the war. And I just expose her to all of the Rashomon-esque reality of the war and let her come up with it herself.
Thank you so much for that, Go Lang. And I think, I think about how Vietnamese is of the oral tradition, and how a lot of what we pass on from one generation to the next happens linguistically or through the senses, like you mentioned, and also through these places. Something that all of you have mentioned so far is, that there should be this sort of return to Vietnam. For me, being born in the United States, like I know that the term DVAN refers to Vietnam, but I myself have not been there, right? So there is this disconnect between me and the culture and heritage there. Viet, I want to pitch to you this question. I mean, what do you want to pass on in terms of Vietnamese heritage and history to your next generation? Because I know that I think your books are dedicated to Ellison and Simone, if I'm not mistaken. So, I mean, I don't know if Ellison can read the Sympathizer just yet, but and I know you're also teaching them Vietnamese as a, something that you've mentioned before in the Accented series, but how are you passing on that heritage and history to them?
Well, in fact, Ellison, the last time he came into my office, picked up the Committed off the shelf and started to read it. And I was like, oh my God, don't read the wrong page with the 4-letter words, So, but, I endorse all the strategies that people are talking about here. They're all lovely. But, my experience growing up Vietnamese was both all of the noble things about our culture and our food and our language and all that other kind of stuff, but also, Vietnamese culture is a bunch of other stuff too. It's like, I associate Vietnamese culture with drinking cognac and smoking and doing all kinds of terrible things and everything like that. And so when do we get to talk about that part of Vietnamese culture? When do we get to talk about the part that Vietnamese people love to gamble and fornicate and cheat and do all these kinds of things? That's Vietnamese culture. And so I just want to make sure that, we don't also lionize and idealize Vietnamese culture at the same time. We're human beings and culture is what we make out of it. So bringing the children back to Vietnam, I think, is really important, because then you get to see what Vietnamese culture really is. It's not some kind of static thing. It evolves, it changes, and people do all kinds of things in Vietnam that are good and bad. My own experience was that when I took Ellison back to Vietnam for the first and only time, I did something I never did before, which is that I was in Saigon. When I go to Saigon or any place in Vietnam, I go for the cheapest hotel I can find that has air conditioning. And I know how to find these hotels for like $20 a night. But because I had him with me at 1 year old, that was his first birthday, I went to the most expensive hotel in Saigon on Dong Ke, and we got a room there just because I want him to like being in Vietnam, because I hear a lot of horror stories about people who take their kids back and they go to the village, and they're like there with the mosquitoes and everything. It's like maybe they won't ever want to go back to Vietnam after that. So anyway, I'm doing my best, doing all the things that you mentioned. Ellison and Simone both like pho, which is fantastic. That's the gateway drug to being Vietnamese, for example. But there is also some resistance. So with Ellison, he's taking Vietnamese online. I don't want him to do what I had to do, which is suffer through Vietnamese Catholic school, which is a form of fascism as far as I'm concerned. So we have a secular Vietnamese language group of parents, and he also has online Vietnamese language tutoring. So things have changed so much. If you want your kids to learn Vietnamese, you can go online and get Vietnamese language tutors like we have. And then finally, he can't eat unless he speaks Vietnamese. Like unless he says something in Vietnamese to me, he's not getting food. And it's working. He is learning Vietnamese vocabulary that way.
I think that's so interesting that you bring that up, because I know that it would be a cultural faux pas if I were to sit at, like a Capital Seafood or something, like somewhere where people have Vietnamese weddings, and start eating first before welcoming everyone else to eat and using the word mai, right? I think that's a cultural tradition that I think gets passed on from one generation to the next just from experience that culture. And I think that you all bring up a really good point too, and I'm bringing it back to Marcelino's point about not romanticizing the history and the heritage and what it means to be Vietnamese, right? And so I'm brought to, I think, a question about like thinking about Vietnamese in diaspora and where we go now. I know that y'all, Go Lang and Viet, you were in a conversation with Columbia University this morning too, and Jilin Hang was talking about the afterlives of the war, right? What happens after April 30th, 1975, as well as, as we think about reconciliation, I think to also pull in a question that was posed, right, from Tedman Chung, is how do we work to enrich and improve the lives of our Vietnamese community members in diaspora and confront fascism and I would say, by extension, authoritarianism without resorting to xenophobia. And then another question from An Jung, who is kind of in the same vein, is, how do younger generations of Vietnamese Americans talk to their older parents and relatives who might be extremely right-wing or share this sort of conservatism, right, or staunchly anti-communist sentiment without necessarily severing family ties? And I want to pitch this question first to Marcelino, because you talked about progressivism and liberalism, and I think in turn, I think you might have a good insight into how we can have these multi-generational conversations about conservatism. So if you wouldn't mind.
I know there was a big debate recently in the States during the latest presidential elections, which divided the Vietnamese community terribly. I can understand why the older generation in the Vietnamese generation in the States can be bitter and what's the word, suffering from nostalgia and be blissfully wounded, to them. I can understand that. I also think that it's necessary to be able to put aside one's opinions and to accept that the idea that the next generation won't necessarily share them. I see this all the time with my children. I'm actually beginning to feel quite a senior, an old man now, because society is evolving around me, and sometimes I feel I have to. The time has come for me to stand back a bit and try not to impose my views. I don't always manage to do that, but I'm trying not to be too not to be an authoritarian with my views, because every generation has its own. I don't know if that answers your question. It's a struggle. It's a struggle between. Viet mentioned Catholic schools as being fascist. Maybe that's a bit extreme. I didn't go to a Catholic school. I went to a state school, but my father was a Catholic and a very sincere Catholic. They're the worst because they really the worst in the sense that they're the most demanding. It's not only ritual, you know. You really have to behave like a Christian. So I understand what you mean, but again, whenever we talk about Vietnamese history, I'm always struck by the fact that all too often each side goes too far. You know, it's like that in many countries. Going too far to the right or to the left, people get hurt. I know it's really boring to be a centrist, and you sound very stuffy and dull, but I can't help feeling a bit like a centrist, because here in France they're quite hot-headed in politics. I can't really feel concerned, or I stay out of the fight, because I think I've had my share of that. Our history shows us how bad things can get when people get very extreme. So I find them very hot-headed sometimes here, and I'm trying to be open to different opinions within my family circle. That's what I meant to say. I don't know if I answered at all your question. It's 4 o'clock.
Right. Thank you so much. I mean, of course, with so much gratitude we have for you, Marcelino, for in France time, it's almost 4 a.m. And I think, right. I mean, what I'm taking a lot away in terms of insight into how we, as the younger generation or the second and third generation, can work towards this possible reconciliation, even though the ideologies might seem so polarizing, right? And I want to pitch this question also to Viet, because you are a fan of the polemics, and a lot of your work is very polarizing in the community and your viewpoints. So if you could talk a little bit about both agency and authoritarianism in the politics of the Vietnamese American community, especially with today, April 30th.
Well, I think what people need to know about me is, number one, I'm irreverent, so that gets me in a lot of trouble. Number two, I am allergic to all forms of authoritarianism and militarized nationalism and jingoistic patriotism, and I don't care where it's coming from, whether it's coming from the former president, whether it's coming from other Americans, or whether it's coming from Vietnamese people. So I love Vietnamese people. I love the Southern Vietnamese refugees. I empathize deeply with the community, but honestly, when I see my fellow Southern Vietnamese refugees performing militarized nationalism, I can't tolerate it. And I will say so, and then people will get upset with me for being irreverent about something that they consider to be sacred. And as a writer, my own feeling is that my job is not to prop up the sacred, but my job is to criticize the sacred, because nothing should be sacred. So anyway, that take on things is not a popular take, but I think that when we were talking about April 30th, and I think Chị Lan brought it up with the idea of Black April versus White April, my take on it is that we both need to be respectful of the very deeply held sentiments and the genuine feelings and the real political reasons why people in the diaspora, especially in the United States, feel this to be a sacred holiday, or not holidays, sacred day of remembrance. And we should be capable of also being critical when those sentiments go overboard, as we heard with Chị Ly as well.
Thanks so much for that, Viet. And I think in a lot of ways, there's so much about Vietnamese culture and tradition that we feel sacred, so sacred that we don't want to cross. And I want to bring up this question from Hayslip about the Vietnamese language and honorifics. And I think in the way that we use honorifics, there's a sort of kinship that is inferred from using anh chị and bác cô chú, right? And to talk about the wordplay, and I think interchange, like how the way that you all refer to each other is different from how I might, refer to you all as go or ju or anerti, right? And I'm not going to pull exactly from that question, but I think that as we think, and we're running kind of short on time, but as we think back to reconciliation and healing and what that means to our community and what steps we might be able to take, I want to ask both Go Ly maybe first. If you could give some insight into, what kind of steps might we be able to take towards healing and reconciliation between generations? Yeah. And that will kind of close this up.
I had this moment to sing you this song. So I have to sing it now before the time run out, okay? So this is answer many questions about Vietnamese overseas. So this is the title, it's Lang Thang. So this is go. Lang thang giữa chốn đất người, thương quê tôi thốc nên lời nhớ quê. Dù đấy đầy đủ mọi bề, hồn tôi vẫn thiếu tình quê lạ lùng. Nói ra ai hiểu cho cùng, nhớ sao tiếng mũi ngồi mông vó vé, nhớ từng cái tiếng bụi tre gió đưa cột kẹt mà nghe âm lòng. Nhớ khi hương lúa dèo trăm, nhớ khi hương lúa đồng đồng thơm tho, nhớ gà gai sáng ó ó, nhớ thằng trẻ hót quạt mó thằng bờn. Nhớ khi nồi đất quặng rơm, nhớ nhiều khúc mía lùi thơm phát thèm. Nhớ nhiều nhập tiếng ru êm, nói sao cho hết nỗi niềm nhớ thương. That is for me on April 30, for every Vietnamese.
Thank you so much, Go Ly.
You're welcome.
And, I'll leave it at that. I don't think anything more needs to be said. I feel like that's so, that brings me back home, right? And what more could we want to feel than home on today? Go Mai, I'll pass it to you if you could talk about healing and reconciliation from your point of view and what steps we might need to take.
I think Marcelino alluded to this, which is that different generations feel different about things. And I'm encouraged when I go back to Vietnam and I see a lot of young Vietnamese Americans going back there to live, to work, to do good, help the needy, the poor. Their parents fled in terror from South Vietnam, and here they are going back, trying to rediscover their roots, trying to do whatever they can to help the country. And so I'm encouraged. I think that I understand that the older generations suffer a lot, and it's hard for them to reconcile. And but I think the younger generations are more open, and so I'm hopeful. I guess not all of them are open to reconciliation, but I think a lot of them are. And I think reconciliation is a two-way street. So I think that the Lan Cao talks about what happened after 75, which still embittered a lot of Vietnamese American refugees. And I think that it's hard for the Vietnamese government right now to acknowledge what it did after the war, that antagonized and hurt a lot of people. But it seems to me that among the younger generation, I think they too are open to look at the mistakes that were made. And so I'm encouraged because my book is being translated into Vietnamese and will be published in Vietnam. So in it, I mentioned a lot of mistakes and a lot of the sufferings that were inflicted. And so that's why I'm encouraged from just seeing what I saw when I go back, and the fact that a publisher in Vietnam wants to publish my book. So I'm encouraged.
Thank you so much for that, Gomai. I'm sure that you're encouraging a lot of folks in the second and third generation now who are still with us in the chat and watching this live stream to really be able to tell not only their stories, but to see where their story intertwines with those of the previous generation. So thank you so much. Marcelino, would you be able to talk a little bit about your thoughts on healing and reconciliation to wrap us on it?
Reconciliation. The fact that there are many people returning to Vietnam is a good thing. I agree with Mai, because the younger generation isn't responsible for the past and should not be held back by the past. And I think that this dialogue they established with Vietnam is helpful for the Vietnamese too, and hopefully it will help to Vietnam to move to a more pluralistic political system, which I hope it will do one day, because I cannot help thinking that the one-party system is outdated. And I am personally hoping that Vietnam will move one day to the sort of thing we have with it's not perfect, our democracy by any means, but I think it's better than a one-party system, be it right-wing or left-wing. And also about reconciliation, now I remember what I wanted to say. There's a lot of talk about this in France, about not so much about the Indochina War, but about the war in Algeria, which has left much more bitterness than the Indochina War. We are hearing a lot of talk about repentance, that the French should repent for all the evil things they did in Algeria during the war. And I believe that, of course, there should be repentance, but I think, as Mai said, reconciliation is a two-way street. And for me, repentance should be on both sides. And if one day the Vietnamese government moves away from its propaganda and the way it tells Vietnamese history in a way I find very propagandistic, we will have made progress, because we are always told about the crimes we committed. But in a war, crimes are committed on both sides. I mean, no one comes out of war unstained. It's a joke, it's a lie to say that you are perfect and the other one is a fiend. So the day they give up that, we call it langue de bois. I don't know of any really good translation for that word, langue de bois. It means sort of recited propaganda. One day, if they move away from that, we will have made progress. Because for me, ça empêche le débat. It is an obstacle to dialogue. And again, it has to be both ways. Reconciliation only comes from each side admitting his shortcomings and his faults. It can't happen only one way. And in France at the moment, I'm sometimes annoyed by this talk about colonialism. Our president in France declared before being elected that colonialism was a crime against humanity. I understand what he means, but I find it completely anachronistic and not very helpful to the debate, and much too extreme to be conducive to a constructive debate on colonialism. I mean, when that sort of thing falls into the ears of poorly educated study-wise youths who are coming from Algerian or other African or other backgrounds, I think that it only opens the wound instead of healing it. And we should be doing the talk about colonialism because we've known what it is, with its terribly oppressive sides, but also I think that Vietnam gained something after all from its almost 100 years of French presence. One thing it gained is that the political leaders in Vietnam of the former generation, the Ho Chi Minhs, the Gia Giap, the Phan Van Dong, they were all from the La Caste de Lettrés, the letter, the Mandarin class. They had all traveled to France, most of them at least, and I think they had gained from, many of them had had a bit of a French education. And why were they so different to other communist leaders in Asia who vociferate? You won't hear Ho Chi Minh or Phan Van Dong during the war vociferating. They know how to talk to Western progressives. You don't raise your voice. You speak calmly and collectedly. You look wise and frail, and that is the best way to reach their hearts. Now, I think this finesse was increased by contact with the colonial dominator, and that in this domination there was also a lot of enlightenment, a lot of research, historical research today admits that Vietnamese nationalists of both sides heard about freedom in French schools where they taught about the French Revolution, etc., etc. So enough one-sidedness. I think that reconciliation means that each side recognizes his faults. It's exactly like in a marriage and a divorce. You have to recognize your part in the failure to get along together.
Thank you so much for that and lending insight into this, to responsibility, where the onus of responsibility lies, to recognition and what it might mean for us to experience reconciliation, especially, you know, and I think just speaking to the way that your art and our art, right, and being Vietnamese in and of itself, I think is so political, right? I'll pass it on to Go Lang, if you could talk a little bit about reconciliation, but also remembrance, right?
Yeah. Well, reconciliation has to be that you reach beyond yourself, right? You're not gonna, you can't be entrenched. And my area of legal scholarship is I'm an international lawyer. So like Viet, I'm just totally against any kind of tribalism and nationalism. And international law, especially developed after World War II, is really designed to deal with and manage the excesses of nationalism and how to manage and contain it in ways that both protect domestic sovereignty and also create connections in an international system. And so that is part of reconciliation, that framework of knowing that you are part of a system, an ecosystem that is not just your tribe, your clan, your family. And I'm very hopeful, as I said, when I go and meet the younger generation in Vietnam. They're very outwardly oriented, maybe even more so than the Vietnamese in Little Saigon, because they know what it is like to be totally insular, and they're just always future-oriented, reaching out. And I like to also think about, because there was a question about our language and the ranking, chú and bác and chị and anh and em and all of that. But what I like about it is that, yes, it is true that it is a ranking system, but it's based on age. So it's not, we all get to a certain age, so it's not exclusive, right? And there is something nice about respecting your elders, but not in an exclusionary way. But what I like about the language is that it's all about connectivity, because you can hardly speak to a person without trying to imagine, if you've never met them before, what would they be if they were part of your connective web, right? So you have to just say, okay, well, that's an, or that's am based on their age. You, if they're like higher ranking than you by age, but lower than your parent because, they don't seem like they're going to be your father or your mother's older sibling. I think that's very nice. That is part of reconciliation, because when you think that it's not just I as an individual or I as a country, isolated, existing in a kind of microcosm, I think the fact that the language itself situates us communally should make us be more willing to reach out. That should be in your soul, to reach out and reconcile with the other connection that you have. So it's built into our language, and I'm hoping that sort of built-in imprint in the Vietnamese soul can be tapped. Not ideologically, because it's very hard to change people's ideology. By a certain age, it's hard to change. But reaching out in that human way, that's so expressive in the way the Vietnamese identity is formed and expressed, should help us reach that sense of, what is your point of view? Because you are a family. We are not, it's not like the English language where it's I and it's capitalized. I is the only pronoun capitalized. So we have a very different worldview than the English, than the American or the English Westerner. And so I think the idea of a nation, I like international law very much, and the combine that with our language, that's how I see the world, and that's how you can only make changes by your writing or making a personal connection with people. And when I make personal connections with people, that's the framework I use.
Thank you so much for that, Go Lang, and the way that you reaffirmed community through your imagination of reconciliation and posit towards the future, and how we can use language to reimagine and recreate what Vietnamese identity means, I think is really beautiful. And I want to just pass it on to Viet to talk about remembrance, to talk about reconciliation, and to also wrap us up, since we are over the 2-hour mark, and it's incredible that you all are still here with us. So, and Viet, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, it's been a fabulous conversation, and I really, I'm so appreciative of all our guests coming to share their insights with us, and for all of you for being with us and listening to us. One of the things I think about is that on this day of April 30th, we are 46 years beyond the end of the war in Vietnam, which is a long time in one respect, but not a long time in another. I'm coming from the United States, and arguably this is a country that has not really fully reconciled itself with its own past. When we talk about things like slavery and the Civil War and many other atrocities in American history, we're still a country struggling over the meaning of these things and their impact upon our lives in the present. So I think when we look at Vietnam and everything it's been through, all the decades of war and colonialism, it's not a surprise that the feelings are still raw in many ways in both Vietnam and in the diaspora. For example, you cannot go to Little Saigon in Orange County and wave a red flag, and you cannot go to Vietnam and advocate for democracy. These are things that are not allowed. So we have a long way to go in terms of reconciliation in broad legal and political sense. And there's so many aspects of Vietnamese history and inequality that have been raised by the Civil War and its aftermath that we're still wrestling with. So I think when it comes to questions of equality and democracy and human rights and all of these deeply intractable issues, we have such a long way to go, and we have to be realistic about that. On the other hand, so many of our panelists have shared their optimism, and I think rightfully so, about the ability of individual conversations, about the capacity of groups of people who are trying to make their own livings and trying to make relationships and establish partnerships underneath all of these big political and legal questions, and the impact of art on this capacity to imagine reconciliation and a different future. For example, I'm thrilled that Chị Mai is going to have The Sacred Willow translated into Vietnamese. It's an incredible book that I think everybody who is concerned about Vietnamese history should read, for example. And all the works of all the panelists should be translated into Vietnamese. But of course, that's been an obstacle for many overseas works to find that translation. But we're starting to see some of that translation taking place. So there are signs of optimism. And those human contacts that people have been talking about, the ability to go back and open businesses and have romantic relationships and form business partnerships, and for Vietnamese people to come to the United States not as refugees, but as immigrants and as international students, and here to forge a new kind of relationship with the Vietnamese Americans that are already here or the ones in France. I think these are all positive signs that we should take heart from. And this work that we do with Accented and Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network is certainly in one way our attempt to also do this work of reconciliation as well. So I want to thank all of our panelists, Ly Hayslip, Lan Cao, Duong Van Mai Elliott, and especially Marcelino Truong, coming in so early in the morning or late at night from France. It was really wonderful to see you all here. Join us, those of you in the audience, for our next event, May 14th, Writing in Diaspora, with the writers Vincent Lum and Kim Thuy, two Canadians of Vietnamese descent that have made a huge imprint on the Canadian literary scene, and our very own Eric Nguyen, debut author. It's going to be a great show. Thanks so much for being with us. Thanks to Philip for hosting us, and DJ Puzzle is going to lead us out.
Khi lên 18 bao anh phải lòng, ba mẹ thường nói hãy liệu cho xong. Mẹ ba không nài ép, mong con có đứng ông chồng trong giới giàu sang. Em nghe mẹ nói em suy nghĩ